I know that you will know this, but I must tell you anyway. There is good, there is evil, and there are feelings inside of your heart that are too unspeakable to mutter behind your hand. But it is one thing to think them, and another to make them into deeds. The old one knew how it felt to cause pain and grief, and she would have a smile to herself every time she could hear a howl of pain from the townsfolk below as they fell beneath her trickery and deceit. But please, let me begin. Long ago in the 18th century there were two evil witches, and they lived in a tall white silver tower. There they sat by the dark of a dying fire. The mother buttoned and drew her dark frock coat closer to her throat as the daughter sat silent in her furs. They knew that this was the time to decide, the time when the winner would have the power over all of the poor wretches who were just like playthings for them, so that they could punish them for the very act of being and breathing. So, my daughter, this is your coming of age, and don't worry, I will not be kind to you. You know that your fate will be to lose, and you will know the fate of imprisonment for many moons before your chance of freedom will return. Her words were like broken fingernails being dragged down a slate board, and she savoured the way that they trickled from her lips like sap from a broken twig. Under her breath, as the flames crackled, you could feel her sniggering the words, "Good is bad. Good is bad. For a witch to be good is very bad." Her daughter had every trace of beauty in her face. Tall, strong, beautiful to the eye, but her smile and eyes had a downturn in their corners, which showed that she was as much to be feared as her hag of a mother was. She knew that she had forgotten herself on more than a few occasions. She had not been kind, she had just forgotten to be evil. In her mother's eyes, this was a kindness, and kindness was looked upon as a weakness, not just by her mother, but by all of those who speak the weirding words. The girl slowly drew the palm of her hand over the dragon's back. If she had a friend in all of this misery, then her pet, Draco, was the only one who ever wished to hear her voice or her footsteps on the rickety stairs to this excuse of a house that would never feel like a home. The die was made of the bones of liars and bound with the blood and hair of thieves. Each side had a golden mark with writing from a far distant time. If the truth was ever a visitor to this place, no one could say exactly what each mark meant, but their significance was easy to decide. Whoever lost would be shrunk to the size of a small child's thumbnail, and they would be placed within the confines of the die to be rattled and thrown like a cat plays with a dying mouse as part of their punishment. The girl's hand closed around the shining sides of the die. It felt hard against the softness of her skin. She had cooed at how wonderful it looked to her as a baby, but she did not know that now she would be really using it and playing for her fate. It had rolled from her hand so many times and without a single consequence. Her heart trembled to think that this was too much, all for the sake of a forgetting to be evil. She looked to her mother in a desperate attempt to see if there could be any turning back. But she knew her mother too well. There'd never been a hand of kindness as a child, and her voice was cold in the night's storm. "Since you have the die, you must throw it first." The words fell to the girl's ear as if they were a death sentence. She raised her hand high and threw. Once upon a prehistoric time, long, long ago, a beautiful and fair princess lived in a dark, damp cave in the middle of a spooky forest. She was running like a cheetah to get away from her evil father. She had no way of knowing how long she had run. Her anger was so strong that she had not even thought about how or where she was going. She only knew that she was not going to stay anywhere where her father stood or breathed. In those times, what passed for beauty was not the fineness of your arms and legs. It was how strong and fit you were, and for those times she was the most beautiful of all of the women in her tribe. She stopped only when her lithe limbs could not stand to move any more. Her brave and beating heart thundered in her chest like a drum, and she could only hear her blood coursing through her ears. It was then that she turned around and looked about her. This was not any part of her world that she knew, and it only made her feel more alone to be in a place so unfamiliar. She was not scared, as fear was a stranger to her emotions. She knew that she could not turn around and find her own way home, but as she moved to return, she saw something on the ground that caught the last dying glow of the moon. It was a mysterious object in both size and shape. She reached a hand towards it, and then she saw that it was an egg about the size of a palm. She held her breath, and it calmed her beating heart, but the vein at her temple throbbed painfully above her eye. It was covered in silver and had writing that was of another time, and it had been crafted by hand. Within her elders, writing had been banned as the work of those who lived in the underworld, and it made her fear to her own gods. "Let me be safe," she whispered as she touched the talisman hanging at her throat. It was the only thing that she had as a reminder of her own mother, who had died so many years before. Her hand felt the cold of the night air trapped in the surface of this egg. She shook it, and it rattled as she shook it. It reminded her of a snake, but no sooner had she picked it up than it slid to the ground. Again, she pushed her hand towards it, but it moved as she moved. As she walked, it moved slowly ahead of her. When she was running, it sped away from her. On and on it went, through the forest and vale and valley and glade. She never tired as she followed blindly, without a care for where she would end this journey. When she had been running from her father, she had felt tired, but now she was obsessed by the way that this beautiful object led her further and further on a path that seemed to know no end. Once upon a happy time, long, long ago, there was once a short boy in a small cottage by the side of a long, deep river that ran through the dark, scary forest. The sun shone so brightly in the sky that he thought that there could never be another summer as good as this. He knew this place, his home, so well that he could almost walk through the lanes and alleyways with his eyes closed. He could always be found with a smile on his face and a song in his heart, and everybody, and I mean everybody, knew him. He always had a cheery, "Ah, yeah," to give to any of his friends or their mothers that he met. He wished that he could meet some of his friends' fathers, or have a talk with his own dad, but he was away in France. His dad's quiet voice echoed in John's head as he remembered the day he left, along with all of his friends' fathers. As the slow train pulled away from the station, he had told him that he was fighting for king and country, and that I'll be back before he knew it. It was the last of his father's words that caused him to blink away the tears. "Don't forget to look after your mum. You're the man of the house now." John didn't want to be the man of the house. He wanted to be his father's son and do the things that they used to do. Football, cricket, or just wrestling in the green grass, or winning the three-legged race at the village fete. Right now, he wouldn't have minded if his dad was here to tell him off. He stood up. It was no use. He was going to have to go for a walk. John always went for a walk whenever he got sad or thought too much about the king and the country, having his dad. The ground was dry on the lane by the woods, and his feet made a great cloud of dust, just like the train at the station's smoke, as he scuffed and dragged his shoes along. John was miles away in his mind when a friendly voice, deep and croaking, woke him up out of his walking dream. "Hello?" John stopped. "If my mammy saw me doing that, she'd scalp me from one end of the street to the other," the voice continued. There, sitting on a bench in a place that John had never seen a bench before, was a boy tucking into the biggest bar of chocolate that he had ever seen in his life. Chocolate was something that he had never known. It was like something from a fairy tale. Nobody, absolutely nobody, had chocolate. And here this boy sat, a big chocolatey grin on his face, and he was looking straight at John. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Can't you even say hello?" John shook himself. "Ah, yeah." He always said this. "S'pose that'll do for now." He patted on the bench and indicated that John could come and sit on the bench. As John sat down beside him, he could see that the new boy's eyes were the deepest, darkest green, where his were the lightest of blue. His hair was jet black, and John's was the fairest blonde that he could get away with without being bullied. Even sitting down, he was still taller than him. If anything, this boy, apart from the fact that he looked as if he were 13 years old as well, was the exact opposite of John, and John couldn't keep his eyes off the huge block of chocolate. Strangely, the chocolate didn't seem to be melting in the heat, and the boy still hadn't offered him any, but to be honest, just being this close to the smell of this rich, sweet brown prize was enough. The tall boy stood up. John's eyes were on the purple and blue wrapper in his hands. "I've heard tell that there's all kinds of monsters, witches, boglins and bogles in the woods. My gran told me about them. Well, she told me about them when I moved here yesterday. Do you fancy a walk in the woods? See what we can see? I like adventures." If there was anything that John didn't want to do, it was to take a walk in the forest. But when James, for that was his name, broke a jaw-breaking lump of chocolate off the block in his hands and offered it to him with a, "Come on then, or are you scared?" John was up out of his seat faster than a speeding bullet. The moon hung low in the dark night sky. It was nothing more than a flicker of a burning branch in the mist-filled sky, and for most of the time it was covered by ragged clouds. Its light was very dim, and hardly anything could be seen in this cold, dark place. There were no lamps lit by the side of the road, and there were no candles that could burn in a window to light anyone's way back home. This was a place where light had been stolen. It had been taken and kept away from everyone. The only warmth and light in this place was a huge fire that was lit in the middle of the old village. It was as tall as a bell that you would find in a tower, and on the deepest and darkest of any autumn evening, everyone would be in that place to see their friends and to be seen by those that they loved. To these people, the black months that surrounded the winter were the worst of all. There was never a star in the sky to bring a smile to their faces. Night to them was a blanket that blocked out all light. It was a nothingness that brought the tears to their eyes. Some of the older people in the town could remember the times when they would have seen shooting stars race between the best of all constellations. Their stories were always welcome by the fire's glow. It is always good to be able to see your friends and to be there by the side of a warming fire to listen to their stories and gossip. With the faint shadows cast by the flickering firelight, you could count the villagers on the fingers of two hands. But there was one girl, about 17 years of age, who stood far away, locked in the shadows from all of the rest of those revelling by the fire's warmth. She was tall, but she was not thin. She was ugly, and her eyes had a selfish turn to them that could have curdled cream in a jug. It's not hard to see why she was so unpopular, but she had a secret. And it was this secret that gave her a twisted smile to her face and gave her a little jump of excitement to her stony heart. Derviana knew where the stars were. Derviana knew what could release them, but she would never tell. It pleased her to be standing here and listening to them all complain about the dark night sky. The more miserable they became, the happier she was. Absent-mindedly, she looked about her, and in the distance she could just imagine the Princess Bridge. She was very pleased that she could not see it, even by the light of the fire. That stupid princess with her airs and graces. A voice screeched inside of her cold heart, like an axe to wet wood. She thought that she had it all. A castle with a silver tower that nobody can see and nobody wants to visit. Not when it's plunged into the dark. She had to stop herself because she was almost in danger of smiling to herself. Once again, as she had done on so many nights, she chanted inside of her head. A princess in a silvery tower, a princess as pretty as a flower. No good to anyone, I took her down a peg. Now she goes to the road to beg. It was true. As soon as the beautiful silver tower could not be seen, visitors to it became as scarce as laughter by a graveyard. The princess had wanted to help everyone, and she had too little money to find an answer to the riddle of the lost stars and their light, and so she had to go on the road and hope and pray that someone would give her money and an answer to the lost light of the village. Once upon a dangerous time, on a misty windy day in a dark, dull and gloomy forest, an old widow was collecting firewood because a fire had died. She was cold as she pulled her old coat about her old shoulders, and her fingers trembled as she reached for the sticks. Stick after stick was pulled from the ground as she tried to think of what it would be like to have a fire burning bright and warm in her own hearth again. She tried to smile, but happiness was far from her thoughts as she trudged and stumbled through the deep, dark, forbidden forest. These pieces of gnarled wood were cold to her touch, and they made her feel colder than she would have done if she had stayed at home with a blanket around her as she sat by the remains of a fire. She was not thinking about what she was doing as she bent to pull another twig from the frozen ground, and then she heard a noise. It was a breaking of a twig beneath a foot that sounded like the snapping of a child's bone. As she stopped her stooping work, she looked about her in this dreaded place, and then she saw it. A bundle of sticks were there on the ground. It was a great bundle, a huge, frost-covered, snow-dusted bundle of sticks, bigger than she could have made in a month of days. Who could this belong to? Her voice sounded thin and reedy on the night air, as it had been some time since she had spoken aloud. She did not know what to do. If someone had made it for themselves, they would not be happy to see that it was gone. But the temptation of a fire made her question herself aloud. I'm sure that I couldn't take it. Could I? She was a kindly old woman, and this was not her way to take what was not hers. Her thoughts stopped dead in the air as she heard a harsh voice behind her.
Well, my dear, what do you want?
The words were colder than the air as this witchetty woman came closer and closer to the widow woman.
Would you like some wood to warm your toes and feet? Just take what you want, my dear.
The witch came closer until she could smell her hair. Her nose was long and thin, and at its tip there was a drop of solid blood. Blood that had come from the lamb that she had killed and gutted to make a steaming cloak about her shoulders. It seemed that she, too, would feel the cold. The widow woman had been told in stories since she was a child of the witches who held this forest as their own land, but she had never dreamed in her worst nightmare that she would ever see one face to face. Without thinking, she turned and ran like the wind beneath a galleon's sails. As she rushed and raced towards her home, she saw more bundles of sticks on the ground, and she was as scared as the lamb must have been beneath the witch's knife. She almost fell in through her door, and she felt safe to be back inside of her house. One sunny day, and once upon a windy time, in that place that we now know as Northern Ireland, there was a poor peasant woman who was thinking about stealing the miserable, sad and angry king's gold. He had enough gold for everyone, but the woman had so little that she had to give her 5 children rabbit pie whenever she was lucky enough to catch a rabbit. She knew that soon she would have to feed them on rats and bats if she couldn't find anything else. Her children were all boys. They were good and strong, tall and always hungry. They were good workers when they had work. But the woman, whose name was Isabella, could only cry when she thought of the empty pots and pans she had, and how she wished she could give her boys good food to eat. Food that would fill them and make them laugh and smile, and the way that they had when her husband was still in the house. Her husband would have made it right. He could make a meal from anything that he could grow, catch and find. He could fish like no other man. He only had to look at the sea and the fish would almost jump into his basket without even having to use his hook and rod. Every seed he pushed beneath the soil seemed to sweep up to the sun in no more than a blink of an eye. She could remember him with that smile of his, and his arms full and a beautiful heart that was filled with all of the joy of the world. Isabella could not look up to the tall, steep hill that the king's castle stood on without crying. And now, on this sunny and windy day, the tears fell from her cheeks like a river runs over rocks. The king's castle could be seen from everywhere for miles around, and that was just the way that he liked it. The walls were made of gold, and the windows were made of diamonds. It glittered and gleamed and shone in the sun as if to make fun of everyone. What I wouldn't give to have just one single brick of his great castle. Isabella's words ran and rattled in the air as she almost spat this sentence out. I wouldn't be sitting there in that great snow-covered place, making fun of the poor people starving down below. I'd make the gold go further, and for everyone. If she had been sad before, then she felt as if her fragile heart would break into 1,000 tiny splinters. She felt a hand on her shoulder, and when she turned around, she could see her eldest son standing, tall as a tree beside her. His 4 brothers were not so very far behind. "What's that you're muttering about now, ma'am?" His voice was as sweet as a lark's in spring. She felt ashamed of wishing terrible things on the king. "Oh, nothing. I was just talking aloud, to no one in particular." But he knew very well what she had thought, just by the look in her eyes. This was not the way that he thought a spaceship should look. It was dirty and it was very smelly. His dad used to call this smell mature food when he was in the car. There was always a carrier bag hanging on the gear stick, and it was always filled with leftover pizza crusts, fish and chip papers, not to mention old bits of fish and chips, and sweet packets and chocolate wrappers, and it made the car stink of mature food and part-melted sweets every time his dad changed gear. Sometimes Tom thought that he would rather walk than have to go in his father's car, but if he held his breath, then it was just about bearable. He'd always read all of the comics about space, and in those pages the spaceships were always clean and tidy and made out of stainless chrome steel, and doors swished open with the tiniest whisper. But here he was, well into the 3rd month, on this stinking, rusty, smelly and badly ventilated hulk of a space dredger on his way to riches and wealth and money. Or at least he hoped that he would be rich once he had dropped off his cargo. Tom Frennick was 15 years old enough to drive a petrol-fuelled car. Not that many people would these days. They'd gone out of fashion in the late 21st century. He was old enough to go on intergalactic journeys just like this one. Old enough to try and make his fortune by dropping off his cargo on the third moon of the 13th planet of the Alpha Centauri quadrant. But he was also old enough to feel a long way away from home and a lot more than just a little bit scared. Ever since he could remember, he'd been running scams to make a few credits. He was well known on the schoolyard internet for always having some money-making idea on the go. He would do homework for the whole of the class in less than a blink of an eye and still get his grades. Mind you, he was careful. He made sure not to get too good a grade for himself. He didn't want the education computer to get suspicious. He would allow some of his friends to do some work for him, and the poor fools would be grateful. What they didn't know was that he was being paid twice as much as he was giving them. But his dad always said, if you want to get something in this world, well, in this universe, you've got to earn it by the sweat of your brow. Tom's dad was a very old-fashioned kind of a man, and he often said things that didn't make any sense at first. But as Tom grew older, he started to realise what he meant. You've got to work for what you want, was another of his dad's sayings, and Tom hadn't taken it to heart. He had taken it to heart in spades. He wanted lots of things, and he worked very hard indeed all of the time. But right here, right now, he wished that his dad was here. He would have told him what to do. It had all seemed so very simple at first. All he had to do was take the footballs that he'd bought from a friend of a very distant friend, at a very good price, and transport them to the far side of the universe and sell them to the beta centurions. Now, I'd better explain. It was not because the beta centurions were particularly fond of football. It wasn't as if they had any feet in the first place. It wasn't as if they had any feet either. To be honest, apart from the odd fold of skin that would pass for a mouth, an eye or an ear, they looked more like a football themselves, except that they were about the size of a garden shed. Admittedly, it would take a good long stretch of the imagination to think of a shed as a sticky blue-grey blob of wrinkly skin, but there are more things in the heavens than on the earth, and Tom had never been fussy about where the money came from. The thing was that they liked smells, and having more than a single human's nose made them very particular about what smells they allowed to go into their bodies. Tales were told of how they would pay a fortune for the slightest whiff of a beautiful smell, how canny business beings could roll around in incredulously high mountains of credits if the right whiff had been delivered to them. There were other tales about the removal of limbs and organs for those who'd brought a nasty niff that did not please them. When Tom thought about that, he felt a little weak, and a bead of sweat would trickle down his brow. He'd been so careful. He'd chosen everything to be just so. He had taken air from the side of a stream in the height of spring. He had a breath of winter's air from Nova Amsterdam on the floating islands of Australia. He had the smell of a newly cut corn meadow of the American plains. He had to collect all of these in the middle of the night. For as you know, the taking and removing of air from Earth is against the law. Let me remind you, if you've forgotten. In the Air Law of 2072, it is still in the statute books now, all these years later, it states that and I quote, "The removal of any quantity of air from the Earth's atmosphere is strictly and severely punishable by placing in stasis for not less than 20 moon rises. Anyone found and caught removing air from the Earth will be liable to immediate incarceration." Just the word incarceration brought a shiver to Tom's back. To be locked up with no sign of relief and being put into stasis where he'd be asleep but awake at the same time, if you know what I mean, didn't strike Tom as a good option. He knew that taking air was wrong. He knew that filling the footballs with air was wrong. But he did know that a lot of money can make you do desperate things. Once upon a bad, dangerous and scary time, I was walking along a narrow, cobbled and dusty road with my two most bestest friends from school. I've got to tell you this, they are the best of all friends in the world. We had been out on Halloween and nothing had been that scary when we had been out. I can't remember who had dared who, but a day was said and a day would have to be carried out. Everyone knows that. I don't think that it was me, but I do know that my granddad had told me about the old disused mine, and we all seemed to be following one another on this dark road. He had always said that his father's father had told him that this was a place where no one should be after the stroke of midnight. It wasn't that late, but I knew my mother would be mad if I didn't get myself home soon. But I've got to tell you that I might have been scared, but I wasn't going to be the one who called the day off. We were just getting used to the dark when we stopped in our tracks. Then there was a movement ahead of us. We just thought that it was some animal. We knew for certain that it couldn't be one of our friends. There was no way that they would have been so stupid as we were being. Whatever it was, and we should have known better, made our feet move towards it. It was madness to be here. And then there was a noise, a terrible noise that sounded for all of the world like a slow, deliberate hammering on a rock. "If that's you, Clarky, trying to scare us!" James Clark was the class clown. He would do anything to cause trouble, and all for the sake of what he had called fun. He'd been a nuisance all night, and we thought that it must be him. Again I called out, "Clarky, it's not funny," and we're not scared. But we were. There was a shadow of something by the flickering light of a candle. We could see a regular up and down movement, and then there was more than just one shadow. Together they seemed to be crouched over a figure that was lying in a pool of blood. Closer and closer, the larger of the two figures moved towards us. At least, I had thought that it was us. I glanced behind me, and my friends were nowhere to be seen. For a second, the clouded moon was chased by a wind that blew from the sea, and for the briefest of seconds, this desolate spot was lit as if it were day. I could not look at the face of the monster before me, but it was what it had in the place of where a hand should be. There was a hook, a huge hook, made of the brightest of steel. It was tipped with gold, and there was a hook above the wrist at each side. If I had ever been scared in my life, then this was the time that I would never forget. Blood dripped from the tips of the hook and the blades. I would have liked to have been anywhere than here if I had a choice. One midnight, in an old, haunted, webby, spooky castle, there was a very big and fat witch with false teeth that didn't fit. It was bad enough that she was cross all of the time, but her teeth made her even more miserable and angry. "Monkey!" She spoke loudly and unkindly to the monkey. Her voice was like a howling wolf, as she once again turned to the beast by her side. "Monkey!" Her teeth, lips and spit made her sound like a mad woman. "Have you got all of the ingredients?" "Have you got all of the ingredients?" Like a stroked cat, her voice was like a feather on a bird's wing when she wanted something. "Have you got all of the ingredients?" Now her words were like honey to the ears. Monkey, and I must tell you this, was once a man, and he had been turned into this animal only as a whim, as a joke by this witch, when he had made the mistake of landing his fishing boat on a terrible island. He was tall, strong and straight, and stood upon his two hind legs. It was only his arms that dragged close to the cobbled floor that let you know that this was not truly a man. Now he reached down with his hand and gathered up something in his cupped palm. He brushed them against his lips, almost as if he was whispering to them as he touched his forehead. Slowly and carefully he opened his hand as she snatched them one by one. "The breath of 7 dead rats." She smiled, but it sounded as if she had a crow in her throat. Counting them out slowly, she put them into a huge copper pot.
7 dead slugs.
Like a key to a keyhole, her voice was nothing more than a scratch on the air. Again they went into the pot, as Monkey smiled to himself in the darkness. Like a monster roaring, her voice was terrible.
7 squashed worms from out of the graveyard.
She really liked these. The witch had screamed as the monkey had whispered.
My weirding words will make it so that I can get away from here and never have to come back.
Her voice was as crooked as a crocodile's tooth, as her thoughts went through her teeth. Her face was screwed up like a mouldy orange, as she clenched her teeth to speak again.
Now I will be able to escape from here.
There was much joy in her face, as she could make, well, as much joy as she could make, with a crooked warty nose and terrible lopsided smile. Out she went with Monkey following behind her. He could walk well, but he had a strange, gleeful look on his face.
Keep up, you stupid animal,
the witch angrily told the monkey, as she made her way towards the ghostly graveyard. Once again the monkey whispered to himself, and his smile became even bigger.
What will you do when I have gone, my monkey? You had better be careful, for I will be back soon. Once I have escaped from the sea-drenched island, I will bring you lots of friends to work with you. An army of monkeys shall live on this island.
Like wolves splashing upon the shore, like the sweet sounds of birds twittering, her voice changed as she spoke these taunting words. She reached into a pocket and pulled out a green candle, Monkey's candle, the one that reminded him of his home. He was shocked, but not surprised that she had stolen the only thing that he still had from when he was a man. It made him remember his family and his friends, and as a tear streaked its way down his furry chin, he was sad to think that she would soon be gone with that thing that was his. She pulled a broom closer to her, and she made to fly high above the sea, and away from this island that had been like a prison to her. Up she went and shouted at the top of her voice, as spit came from out of her mouth, "Fly me away from here, and candle light my way!" One sunny day at dawn, a huge thunderclap of a bang rattled out over the top of a quiet house in the silent countryside. Clarick stood at his window and smiled to himself to see that he had woken all of the villagers up.
Oh, you see how they try to rub their eyes and settle themselves.
He turned to his companion, a demon by anyone's estimation. Horned and cloven-footed, he rocked forward and back, enjoying his cruel master's joy at causing even more unhappiness.
Yes, they will know more sorrow before the moon rises this night. But they will not have the eyes to see it.
His voice was raised to the heavens in a glee that should never have been felt in anyone's heart. The demon slowly clapped his hands, but his lips had a downturned look that would have shown his distaste to this evil sorcerer had he taken the time to look. This king of a rainbow castle revelled in making pain flow through his people's veins. He always wanted to make sure that they knew their place. He had a castle that stood out amongst so many others in this barren but beautiful place. Each of the bricks was of a radiant colour and had been cut from a different part of the world. It was this that made it stand out against so many castles standing like sentries on the side of a hill. Now it is here that he raised his hand to the demon, cowering by his side. There was a flinch at the sight of a hand above him, for the demon had known Clarick's fist more than it had ever felt his hand. The words spewed from his mouth like a baby would spit out foul food.
"Listen carefully, my dear pet."
This unexpected sweet phrase made his companion uneasy, but still he continued.
"I will teach these fools to look at my home.
I will teach these fools to look at my home and feel as if they could live here." He moved his hands slowly and carefully in an intricate pattern that in other times would have looked like a dance, but their effect was too terrible to think about. The words were old and they had no meaning in this time, but they fell to the ground from his curled mouth almost like a mist in a forest storm, and still they spilled to the ground. With a gathering coldness, they slipped and slithered, crept and crawled over the ground and slid between the bones and rib cages of his skeleton army. This was at a time when the whole of the world was at war with one another, and this user of magic would have given anything to have seen them fight, but here in his castle in New Leeds, he was so far away from all of man's knowing that he neither knew nor cared. Pleased with his work, he turned and spoke.
"Make my golden hook ready for my sleep."
The look in his eye gave no doubt to his frightened servant that this task was to be done without any delay. He rushed and fussed at the hideous hook as it hung by the side of the old oaken door. Quickly he raised his master. He weighed no more than a baby, and he carefully fitted its pointed end in that place beneath the crook of his chin on the pointed bones of his chest. As he plummeted into sleep's arms, he muttered as he dreamed,
"Bring the lantern to me when my work is fully done. I wish to collect as much of their sight as I can before the next dawn's light."
My grandpa is a very old man, and he likes to walk by the side of the silvery stream. He is tall, kind, wrinkly and thin, and I will tell you what happened to him on one fine summer's day by the edge of the water. The sun was beating down, and as he walked, his back was bent, and he pulled his old white hat from his head and wiped his brow. When he rested on his cracked and creaking walking stick, he would straighten up, and when I was a baby, he looked as tall as the trees themselves, and now he stood, licking at his lips and wondering if the water would taste as good as it did when he was a boy. He scratched at his head, then stroked at his chin as he put his hat back on. Using his stick to bear his weight, he put his hand into the shape of a cup, sculled some water into his palm, and he watched the rainbow drops of water spill down. He could see the ripples as they waded across the surface of the water, and his reflection showed the years that he had lived in the rows of lines on his chin and cheeks. I don't suppose a single drop would hurt. He had a smile on his face as the water trickled across his lips. It tasted even better than it did when he was first here as a boy in short trousers. He was very thirsty indeed, and he looked for something to put some water into so that he could have a good long drink. All he could see was a rusty tin. His voice rattled in the emptiness of the wood by the side of the river. I suppose I'll just have to use my hat. These words made him laugh out loud, and it wouldn't be the first time. The sun felt hot on his face as his hat was lowered into the stream. He was so thirsty that he filled it right to the brim. As the hat came closer to his lips, he made a start and jumped, because there in the water he could see not one, not two, not three, not four, but 5 eyes looking at him. It was not such a great shock to find something living in the hat filled with water as when he saw a tongue. A long, thin, black, forked tongue dart right out from under the water, and it was attached to a snake. A cobra. A king cobra, all sleek and oily green in the sunlight. So, old man. The snake's voice was thin and sinister in the sunlight. So, old man, you feel thirsty? Did you ask permission to drink from my pool? My grandpa stood up straight. He did feel a little strange talking to a snake. Well, old man, do you feel thirsty? Did you want to ask me now? The snake did not have a drop of a smile on its face. Well, should you drink, or will I bite you to make you talk? I've got to tell you this. My grandpa is not frightened of anything, and he didn't wait to be asked again. He threw his hat down and picked up his stick, and he whacked that snake right in the biggest of all of its 5 eyes. There was a blood-thickening squeal that cracked the air open as the snake lay on the ground, writhing in pain and agony on the muddy river's edge. If my grandpa had ever been frightened, then he was frightened now, but he didn't show it. Quicker than a thought or a blink and a wink of an eye, the snake lunged forward and dug its sharp fangs into my grandpa's arm. He could feel the slow trickle of the venom seeping into his bloodstream. He had heard such terrible stories of arms changing through all of the colours of the rainbow and then falling off, and he didn't really want to look, but he couldn't keep his eyes from his arm. The snake, still attached to his arm, spoke again. So, old man, you have spirit, and I like that. Don't take your eyes away, and I will guarantee that you will like what you see. The snake slunk and slithered, crept and crawled away from his arm and spoke, its voice like a sweetened honey on the ears. Yes, you will see that your arm is younger. Soon you will be able to stand up without that stick. Soon you will be able to walk and run as you did when you were a boy. As he looked, my grandpa gasped. His arm and skin were tightening. His back felt strong. He watched in wonder as he saw his stick fall and then float down the stream. So, old man, I have helped you. Now you need to help me.